Welcome to Worlds of Speculative Fiction, session number 96. This time around, we're going to be looking at a single work, and it is quite the massive tome, as you can see. It is Stephen King's The Stand, and I am going to preface this by saying that there's two different versions of The Stand out there, a topic that we're going to talk about in just a bit. There's a 1976 shorter version, and then there is the 1990 longer updated version with portions of the text that were left out. A lot of the references were reworked by Stephen King in republishing the work, and this is the one that we're going to be looking at for this session. Now, if you're not familiar with Worlds of Speculative Fiction, this is a monthly series that I have been doing. We're now in the 10th year of it. It began as an in-person monthly session series hosted by the Brookfield Public Library. And when COVID hit, which, by the way, is going to get talked about a little bit in relation to this book, we shifted to an online format like what you see here. So I produce a video like the one you're watching now that runs anywhere from 90 to 120 minutes, depending on how much we want to say. We do a video premiere. We do live chat where people can interact with me while they're watching and listening to the video. And then we meet after that for some further conversation in Zoom. If you missed that, that's all right. You can put comments below and I'll respond to them so we can continue the conversation. And we're getting close to number 100. I'm just going to put something out there. We're going to do something really special for session 100. And I'm not going to say quite what it is yet, but that's going to be happening early next year. So, put that in your back pocket for right now. I also want to say one other thing about this particular book. So I have been a Stephen King fan since I was probably, well, we can say I was a teenager. Maybe I was 12 or so when I first started reading some of his stories. And I remember, reading a lot of short stories, reading Christine, reading The Dead Zone, a few others early on that particularly impressed me. And I also had, friends and family members who were into Stephen King as well, including my uncle A. May, who you may have heard me talk about in my Sadler's Stories videos. He was a big reader, and he really liked Stephen King. He helped to get me kind of back into King when I was hanging out with him during graduate school. And he was like, you should read these books again, right? So I did. And I had never actually read The Stand. I'd seen the sci-fi, well, it wasn't sci-fi, it was somebody else adapted it and sci-fi ran it, television adaptation of it. And I knew the basic premise, but I'd never actually read this book. So every year in Worlds of Speculative Fiction, we run a kind of, fan solicitation. We say, hey, what would you like some of the slots in the coming year to focus on? What series, what stories, what narrative universes? And interestingly, a lot of people said The Stand, and when we actually did the vote for the 3 slots that we had available, The Stand was the most popular one. So I was like, okay, probably something really there that I need to look into. And that's what I decided to do. I finished reading this, by the way, while I was laid up in the hospital recovering from a fall that resulted in a shattered hip socket and necessitated emergency hip replacement surgery. I think I finished like the last 200 pages of the book while I had that, time on my hands. And it's really an excellent narrative. So I should tell you a little bit about what we're going to do. So this is our first time looking at Stephen King. We're definitely going to go into his biography because I think that's relevant not only to this work, but his writing style. We'll look at some of the things that he actually says about The Stand specifically, and more broadly about his own writing processes. He's written several books about writing or retrospectively looking at his works, but we're also going to draw heavily on interviews that he's done. We'll talk about the differences between the two different editions, actually drawing on part of what King says here in the preface to this particular version. We're going to talk a lot about the world building that is going on and the genre. This is effectively a post-apocalyptic / supernatural story. King is particularly known for horror, but I would say this is not really within the realm of horror unless we want to extend it very widely. We could actually look at it as being sci-fi for that matter, but I think post-apocalyptic probably best describes the genre, and we'll talk about why. And we'll talk about some of the key philosophical themes, and there's many, we won't get to all of them, that are being explored, set out for us, put into the mouths of characters for us in this wonderful, big, thick novel. I mean, we can call it a novel, but it's longer than most novels, isn't it? Should we call it like a maxed out novel or something like that? There's some perhaps genre debate that we could be happening. So we're going to do a lot of things in this session. We'll try to cover all of those bases. Hopefully you will enjoy this, and you're welcome to participate by way of making comments, to which I'll respond as well. Try to keep them on point. We're not talking about everything under the sun. We're focusing on Stephen King, this book, its narrative universe, and the key philosophical themes of it. So, hope you enjoy it. If you haven't read The Stand, hopefully this will induce you to checking out a copy or buying a copy somewhere and digging into it in the months to come. Before we dive into the many things that we're going to discuss in this session, I thought it might actually make sense for us to look at what Stephen King himself provides us with in this particular edition of The Stand. So there's an author's note, which I'm not going to read all of, but some of it is worth talking about. He says, "The Stand is a work of fiction as its subject matter makes perfectly clear. Many of the events occur in real places, such as Ogunquit, Maine, Las Vegas, Nevada, and Boulder, Colorado, and with these places I have taken the liberty of changing them to whatever degree best suited the course of my fiction. I hope that those readers who live in these and the other real places that are mentioned in this novel will not be too upset by my monstrous impertinence to, quote, Dorothy Sayers, who indulge freely in the same sort of thing. Other places, such as Arnett, Texas, and Shoyo, Arkansas, are as fictional as the plot itself." So we're going to come back to that in the discussion of the world building, the narrative universe that The Stand is occurring within. But let's go on. He gives us a much longer preface in two parts. So this is kind of funny. The first part is to be read before purchase. You're looking at this book. Second, to be read after purchase. Now, for somebody like myself who didn't buy the book but got it from the library, perhaps purchasing doesn't place it in the proper framework, but I think we can get a lot out of this. So the very short part one, he says, There are a couple things you need to know about this version of The Stand right away, even before you leave the bookstore. And he says, this is not a new novel. If you hold misapprehensions on that score, let them be dispelled right here, right now, while you're still a safe distance from the cash register, which will take money out of your pocket and put it in mine. The Stand was originally published over 10 years ago. Second, this is not a brand new, entirely different version of The Stand. You will not discover old characters behaving in new ways, nor will the course of the tale branch off at some point from the old narrative, taking you, constant reader, in an entirely different direction. So that's really good to know, right? He's telling you up front, I am taking the same novel that I wrote and I'm doing something with it that's not going to change the novel radically. But what is different? He says, this version of The Stand is an expansion of the original novel. You won't find old characters behaving in strange new ways, but you will discover that almost all of the characters were in the book's original form doing more things, or we might actually say suffering more things in the case of some of the chapters. And if I didn't think some of the things were interesting, perhaps even enlightening, I would never have agreed to this project. If that is this is not what you want, don't buy this book. If you bought it already, I hope you saved your sales receipt, right? If this expansion is something you want, I invite you to come along with me just a little further. I have a lot to tell you, and I think we can talk better around the corner. That's leading to part 2 after the purchase. And so I think he's giving you a very interesting preview here, right? This is an expansion. It's sort of like getting the director's cut, what the director actually intended with a film, not what ended up having to be the case. Now, in part 2, he's going to tell us why things turned out the way they did. So, he says, this is not so much a preface as an explanation of why this new version of The Stand exists at all. It was a long novel to begin with, and this expanded version will be regarded by some, perhaps many, as an act of indulgence by an author whose works have been successful enough to allow it. Now, I'm going to stop there and say something. So when Stephen King first starts writing, he's writing shorter novels, right? And some people have attributed like the growing length of the novels to his drug use or things like that. And he said, yeah, maybe there's something to that. But there's also a sense in which as you become successful, you can get away with more, right? You have more leverage, more capacity to push back against the publishing companies. And so, some of the, let's call them middle works, wind up becoming longer and longer. So The Stand fits in there. So he goes on and he says, whether the book was too long to begin with or has become so in this edition is a matter I leave to the individual reader. Each of us gets to decide. I only wanted to take this little space to say, I am republishing The Stand as it was originally written, not to serve myself or any individual reader, but to serve a body of readers who have asked to have it. There's a demand for this. I would not offer it if I myself didn't think those portions which were dropped from the original manuscript made the story a richer one, and I'd be a liar if I didn't admit I'm curious as to what its reception will be. I'll spare you the story of how The Stand came to be written. The chain of thought which produces a novel rarely interests anyone but aspiring novelists. They tend to believe there's a secret formula to writing a commercially successful novel, but there isn't. You get an idea. At some point, another idea kicks in. You make a connection or series of them between ideas. A few characters suggest themselves. A possible ending occurs to the writer's mind. At some point, the novelist sits down with a paper and pen, a typewriter, or a word cruncher. When asked, how do you write, I invariably answer one word at a time, and the answer is dismissed, but that's all. It sounds too simple to be true, but consider the Great Wall of China. One stone at a time, man. That's all, one stone at a time. So he says, for readers who are interested, the story is told in the final chapter of Danse Macabre, so you can read it there. For the purposes of this book, what's important is that approximately 400 pages of manuscript were deleted from the final draft, the 1978 edition of the novel. The reason was not an editorial one. If that had been the case, I would have been content to let the book live its life and die its eventual death as it was originally published. Okay, so what was the reason? Not a literary one. It was an economic one, he's going to say. The cuts were made at the behest of the accounting department. They totaled up production costs, laid these next to the hardcover sales of my previous 4 books, and decided that a cover price of $12.95 was about what the market would bear. I was asked if I would like to make the cuts or if I would prefer someone in the editorial department to do that. Now, pause on that a moment. You have written a manuscript that you stand behind. Someone comes along and says, not so economically viable. Now, your new baby, your child, which is often how authors see their works. This is an idea that goes all the way back to Plato, by the way, and articulated in the Symposium. Will you cut it? Or should we farm it out to these people over here and they'll do the cuts themselves? Both suck, right? So King goes on and he says, I reluctantly agreed to do the surgery myself. I think I did a fairly good job for a writer who's been accused over and over again of having diarrhea of the word processor. There's only one place, Trash Can Man's trip across the country from Indiana to Las Vegas, that seems notably scarred in the original version. If all the story's there, one might ask, then why bother? Isn't it indulgence after all? It better not be. If it is, then I spent a large portion of my life wasting my time. As it happens, I think that in really good stories, the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. And he gives an example of a cut-down version of Hansel and Gretel, and he says, consider this perfectly acceptable version of Hansel and Gretel, and he says, I don't know what you think, but for me, that version's a loser. It's like a Cadillac with the chrome stripped off and the paint sanded down to dull metal. It goes somewhere, but it ain't, boss. Then he tells us something else. I haven't restored all 400 of the missing pages. There's a difference between doing it upright and just being downright vulgar. Some of what was left on the cutting room floor when I turned in the truncated version deserved to be left there, and there it remains. Other things, such as Francine's confrontation with her mother early in the book, seem to add that richness in dimension, which I, as a reader, enjoy deeply, right? And he goes back to talking about Hansel and Gretel, which I'm going to skip over. And then he says, I always, here he goes. He says, so here is the stand, as its author originally intended for it to roll out of the showroom. All its chrome is now intact, for better or for worse. The final reason for presenting this version is the simplest, although it's never been my favorite novel, as it is the one that people who like my book seem to like the most. When I speak, people always seem to speak to me about The Stand. They discuss the characters as though they were living people and ask frequently, well, what happened to so-and-so? I get letters about that from time to time. Then he talks a little bit about the idea of a movie, which we're going to skip over here as well. And then he's going to say something, and we're going to see this come up a little bit later, an important theme as he caps this off that we'll look at in interviews. He says, finally, I write for only 2 reasons: to please myself and to please others. In returning to this long tale of dark Christianity, I hope I've done both. Now, that term, dark Christianity, isn't that an interesting, tantalizing idea? So now that we've looked at that, we can do a little bit of what we typically go into here. Let's jump into a bit of world building and looking at the narrative universe in which this story plays itself out. Given that this series is Worlds of Speculative Fiction, we certainly should talk about the world building involved here. And you might say, well, King made it rather easy on himself by picking the real world that we inhabit, whether in the late 70s or in the late 80s, to set this story within. As we've seen, he says, yeah, some places I focused on exactly, but I twisted them in the ways that I wanted to for the story, and other places I made up as well. But this is a post-apocalyptic novel, so, you can do post-apocalypse in multiple ways. You could have it, far off in the future, kind of unidentifiable, or with little glimpses, like, in Planet of the Apes, the Statue of Liberty being seen at the end. Or you can do it in a very contemporary way, and that's the sort of story that King wanted to tell. So what is radically different about this world? There is a superflu called by a number of different names that has incredible lethality, more than any other infection that we have faced in the history of humankind, that it looks like, the American military developed and it somehow escapes, gets out of containment, and that happens in the very first chapter of the work. We see this interesting part. It's actually, the circle opens, right? And we have this guy, Charlie, telling his wife, we need to get away. We need to get out of here. And he's thinking, where was far enough? Reno, Vegas, Salt Lake City? And as it's going to turn out, they're going to drive way past that into Texas and get quite a good extent, but it's not going to save them. And we find out, he's going to say, they're all D-E-A-D down there. He's spelling it out so that his child won't get it. And he says, everything's supposed to maglock if the clock goes red. They got a Chubb computer that runs the whole place, and it's supposed to be fail-safe. I saw what was on the monitor, and I jumped out the door. I thought the goddamn thing would cut me in half. It should have shut the second the clock went red, and I don't know how long it was red before I looked up and noticed it. But I was almost to the parking lot before I heard it thump shut behind me. If I'd looked up 30 seconds later, I'd be shut up in that tower control room now like a bug in a bottle. And his wife says, what is it? What? And he says, I don't know. I don't want to know. All I know is that it K-I-L-L-E-D them quick. If they want me, they'll have to catch me. I was getting hazard pay, but they ain't paying me enough to hang around here. Wind's blowing west. We're driving east. Come on now. So that is what they do, and he's already coughing because he's been exposed to this superflu. It is going to kill over 99% of humankind and spread rapidly across the world. And so it's a story that's told in America with, little bits and pieces of speculation about other places. But it's happening in particular spots in America, depending on where the characters are. So we have, a small Texas town with a gas station where his car crashes and people get infected. They try to contain that. We have New York City, where a musician who's been out in L.A. flies back to sort of get his head right and actually get away from people he owes money to. And it's going to hit New York City as well. We have Maine. We have all sorts of places where this is breaking out and just over time killing people. And then there's actually going to be a second culling or killing that King talks about. Not only have all these, people died and everything that goes along with them breaks down. The military can't effectively function anymore. Communication networks break down. Some places keep power, but eventually power plants are going to, go under as well. there's all sorts of, we could call them cumulative effects that are going to take place, leaving these survivors dazed, trying to figure out what the hell is going on. What do we do? How do we survive? Many animals are also going to die as well, including a lot of domesticated animals. There will be some people who are immune, it turns out. They get sick, but they get better. And what are they going to do? Some of them are going to die of other reasons. There's nobody to give them effective medical care unless they happen to find a doctor or a nurse who didn't die of the virus. And so getting an infection, not knowing how to administer antibiotics, just as in days of yore, can kill you. Having an accident, falling down a hill, riding in a car and crashing into something. Anything can wind up killing you, including other wild animals that might go after you as well. So it's a pretty dire state. And I'm going to read some sections that illustrate the new world that the survivors are living in for the time being. So first we get Stu, right? He survives, and he's in a military medical installation, and he's being told by this Dietz fellow, he says, the situation exists, we're trying to cope with it, all of us, but that doesn't make us responsible. And Stu asks, well, who is? And Dietz says, nobody. On this one, the responsibility spreads in so many directions it's invisible. It was an accident. It could have happened in any number of ways. And then he asks, well, what about the others? Hap and Hank Carmichael and Leila Brewitt, their boy Luke, Monty Sullivan? Dietz says, classified. Going to shake me some more? If it'll make you feel better, shake away. And he says, they're alive. You may see them in time. What about Arnett, the little town that he came from? Quarantined. Who's dead there? Nobody. You're lying. Sorry you think so. When do I get out of here? I don't know. Classified? No, just unknown. You don't seem to have this disease. We want to know why you don't have it. Then we're home free. All of these are lies. All these people that he's referencing are dead. And things are terrible outside. And he's going to manage to escape. Two of the other main characters of this story up in Maine, Franny, who turns out to be pregnant, and Harold, a kind of nerdy type who gets beaten up quite a lot in town. He's one of the only people who survives, and he says, I've been driving around town in a Cadillac on my learner's permit, and he has stolen some boots, and Franny says, what's the line? I'll be in your dream if you'll be in mine. We're not crazy, Harold. And he says, maybe it would be better if we are. And she says, someone will come. After a while, after this disease, whatever it is, burns itself out. Who? Somebody in authority. Somebody who will put things back in order. He laughed bitterly. My dear child, sorry, Fran. It was the people in authority who did this. They're good at putting things back in order. They've solved the depressed economy, pollution, the oil shortage, and the Cold War, all at a stroke. All of these crises that were previously going on in the United States and the world. Yeah, they put things in order. All right, they solved everything the way Alexander solved the Gordian knot, by cutting it in two with his sword. But it's just a funny strain of the flu, Harold. I heard it on the radio. Mother Nature just doesn't work that way, Fran. You're somebody in authority, got a bunch of bacteriologists, virologists, and epidemiologists together in some government installation to see how many funny bugs they could dream up, bacteria, viruses, germplasm, for all I know. And one day some well-paid toady said, look what I made. It kills almost everybody. Isn't it great? And then they gave him a medal and a pay raise and a time-sharing condo, and then somebody spilled it. All right, so this is how they got there. A little bit further, we're looking at Bateman and Stu talking to each other. So Bateman was an assistant professor of sociology at Woodville Community College. Woodville, he says, was a small town famous for its community college and its 4 gas stations, another 6 miles down the road. And he says, here's my thoughts on things. I was prejudiced against the world. I admit that freely. The world in the last quarter of the 20th century had, for me at least, all the charm of an 80-year-old man dying of cancer of the colon. They say it's a malaise which struck all Western peoples as any century draws to a close. We've always wrapped ourselves in mourning shrouds and gone around crying, "Woe to thee, O Jerusalem," or Cleveland, as the case may be. And he gives some examples of that. And he says, it's in the last 3 decades of any given century, your religious maniacs arise with facts and figures showing that Armageddon is finally at hand. Such people are always there, of course, but near the end of the centuries, their ranks appear to swell, and they're taken seriously by great numbers of people. Monsters appear. Attila the Hun, Genghis Khan, Jack the Ripper, Lizzie Borden, Charles Manson, Richard Speck, and Ted Bundy in our own time. It's been suggested by colleagues, even more fanciful than I, that Western man needs an occasional high colonic purging, and this occurs at the end of centuries so that he can face the new century clean and full of optimism. In this case, we've been given a super enema, and when you think about it, that makes perfect sense. We're not just, after all, simply approaching the centenary this time. We're approaching a whole new millennium. And Bateman paused. Now that I think about it, I am dancing on the grave of the world. Stu took one beer, thought over what Bateman had said. It's not really the end, he said at last. At least I don't think so. Just intermission, which is going to turn out to be quite true, but a catastrophic intermission, right? Of great sorts. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. There's an interesting discussion that's being held, a meeting, right? And we're going to come back in a moment to talk about, well, why are they having these meetings? We get excerpts from the minutes of the ad hoc committee meeting, August 13, 1990. The meeting was held in the apartment of Stu Redmond and Francis Goldsmith. All members of the ad hoc committee were present, those being Stuart Redmond, Francis Goldsmith, Nick Andros, Glenn Bateman, Ralph Brentner, Susan Stern, and Larry Underwood. And we get all this interesting discussion going on. Now, why are they having a meeting? And where are they having it? In Boulder. Because there are 2 main power centers in this new world, in America at least. We don't know what's going on in other places. People of one sort are being attracted to Las Vegas and to other parts of, that area, including bits of California. Other people are being drawn to Boulder. So that means that some of the surviving population are all heading east, or in some cases south or north. And why? Well, as we're going to see, there are 2 key people that they're seeing in their dreams, that they're being reached out to by, and in some cases actually impacted by. Bragg will get, some people out of sticky situations and take them in. But we're going to come back now to something else that's happening. So there's some discussion of the dark man who is haunting people's dreams, right? And this is Mother Abigail actually talking with Nick. He says that going to Boulder is the right thing. Mother Abigail said it's what we're meant to do. So first they meet and then they go to Boulder to restart civilization, so to speak. And here we get to a key feature of this new landscape, the Dark Man. Nick says, how much do you know about the Dark Man? Do you know who he is? Nick has to communicate through writing because he's deaf-mute. I know what he's about, but not who he is. He's the purest evil left in the world. So this is not saying he's the devil, right? He's the purest evil left in the world. The rest of the bad is little evil. shoplifters and sex fiends and people who like to use their fists. But he'll call them. He's started already. He's getting them together a lot faster than we are. Before he's ready to make his move, I guess he'll have a lot more. Not just the evil ones that are like him, but the weak ones, the lonely ones, and the ones that have left God out of their hearts. Maybe he's not real, Nick wrote. Maybe he's just the scared bad part of us all of us. Maybe we're dreaming of the things we're afraid we might do. Ralph frowned over this as he read it aloud, but Abby grasped what Nick meant right off. It wasn't much different from the talk of the new preachers who got on the land in the last 20 years or so. There really wasn't any Satan. That was their gospel. There was evil, and it probably came from original sin, but it was in all of us, and getting it out was as impossible as getting an egg out of its shell without cracking it. According to the way these new preachers had it, Satan was like a jigsaw puzzle, and every man, woman, and child on earth added his or her own little piece to make up the whole. Yes, that hell had a good modern sound to it. Now, notice this. The trouble with that is that it wasn't true. And if Nick was allowed to go on thinking that, the dark man would eat him for dinner. She said, "You dreamed of me. Ain't I real?" Nick nodded. "And I dreamed you. Ain't you real? Praise God, you're sitting right there with a pad of paper on your knee." The other man, Nick, he's as real as you are. Yes, he was real. She thought of the weasels who attacked her in the dark and of the red eye opening in the darkness. And when she spoke up again, her voice was husky. "He ain't Satan," she said, "but he and Satan know of each other and have kept their counsels together of old. He's west of the Rockies now. Sooner or later, he'll come east. Maybe not this year, but when he's ready, and it's our lot to deal with him." Nick was shaking his head, disturbed. "Yes," she said quietly. "You'll see. There's bitter days ahead, death and terror, betrayal and tears, and not all of us will be alive to see how it ends." Right? So, very important discussion going on there that kind of illustrates the central plot. But the plot isn't just, the good guys versus the bad guys, because as we're going to see, it's not so simple as that. There's betrayal going on. There's good people who think that they're bad and have to struggle with that. There's even some decent people, although they don't last long, on the side across the Rockies. But two camps are forming, one around this figure who is doing things hierarchically in ways that can be understood as totalitarian or fascist or just bloodthirsty. And then Mother Abigail is not a savior. She is interested in seeing people come together and form, something new of their own. And this is happening in the former United States of America. And what we really have here is kind of two different visions of a post-apocalyptic America. How do you reconstitute either a power structure of domination and exploitation and dog-eat-dog, which will then attack the others, or something like what's good about democratic governance and people coming together? And that is what is going to happen. So King will actually say at some point, this is a political novel, but it's happening in this post-apocalyptic space that we can so easily, imaginatively place ourselves into, at least those of us who are from the times that were being written about. It might be a little bit more difficult, just, very historical for younger people growing up in an age of cell phones and, the internet. Obviously, that stuff is not existing in this time, and there's probably a lot of references to cultural products and even physical objects that may, not ring true anymore. But this was, written in the 70s and then published again in 1990. So that is our setting. That is the narrative world that King is constructing for us. Stephen King has given just a vast variety of interviews over the years, and I am going to concentrate on just a very few of them that discuss The Stand in particular, but also some ideas that he has about where his writing process takes him, how he sees his own works, and the inevitable question about The Stand and our recent, flirtation with a pandemic in the coronavirus, which he's talked about quite a bit. And, jokes have even been made about that as well. So we're going to start with the Paris Review interview. And this is beginning in a very sort of like top-heavy, where do you get your biggest ideas from? Not yet The Stand. So he's asked, what do you think we're afraid of, we human beings? And he says, I don't think there's anything I'm not afraid of on some level. But if you mean, what are we afraid of as humans? Chaos, the outsider. We're afraid of change. We're afraid of disruption. That's what I'm interested in. I mean, there's a lot of people whose writing I really love. One of them is the American poet Philip Booth, who write about ordinary life straight up, but I can't do that. We're terrified of disruption. We're afraid somebody's going to steal our mushrooms in the checkout line. He's giving us an example of one very trivial fear. And then the interviewer says, would you say then that this fear of chaos, of disruption, is the main subject of your fiction? And King says, I'd say that what I do is like a crack in the mirror. If you go over the books from Carrie on up, what you see is an observation of ordinary middle-class American life as it's lived at the time that particular book was written. In every life, you get to a point where you have to deal with something that's inexplicable to you, whether it's the doctor saying you have cancer or a prank phone call. So whether you talk about ghosts or vampires or Nazi war criminals living down the block, we're talking about the same thing, which is an intrusion of the extraordinary into ordinary life and how we deal with it. What that shows about our character and our interactions with others and the society we live in interests me a lot more than monsters and vampires and ghouls and ghosts. And so he's telling you, these are my key themes. I'm not doing horror just for horror's sake. I'm a crack in the mirror, right? I'm showing something that you might otherwise miss. Coming back to this key theme, Rolling Stone interview. The interviewer says, the vast majority of your books deal with either horror or the supernatural. What drew you towards those subjects? And King says, that's built in, that's all. The first movie I ever saw was a horror movie. It was Bambi. Now, usually we're like, oh, Bambi, it's an animal movie, it's a fantasy, it's a cartoon. He's calling it a horror movie. On what grounds? He says, when that little deer gets caught in a forest fire, I was terrified. But I was also exhilarated. I can't explain it. My wife and kids drink coffee, but I don't. I like tea. My wife and kids won't touch a pizza with anchovies on it, but I like anchovies. The stuff I was drawn to was built-in part of my equipment. And so then the interviewer says, by writing horror novels, you entered one of the least respected genres of fiction, which is true, right? And King says, yeah, it's one of the genres that live across the tracks in the literary community, but what could I do? That's where I was drawn. I love D.H. Lawrence and James Dickey's poetry, Emile Zola, Steinbeck, Fitzgerald, not so much. Hemingway, not at all. Hemingway sucks, basically. If people like that, terrific. But if I set out to write that way, what would have come out would have been hollow and lifeless because it wasn't me. And I have to say this, to a degree, I have elevated the horror genre. And I'll mention that King places himself in a kind of lineage where Poe, who's considered real literature but also, horror, leads to Lovecraft, who also, was writing in the pulps, but we consider to be literature as well, to King, right? He's talked about that many times. Then he's asked, what about evil? Do you believe there is such a thing? So this is integral to understanding horror I would say. He says, I believe in evil, but all my life I've gone back and forth about whether or not there's an outside evil, whether there's a force in the world that really wants to destroy us from the inside out, individually and collectively, or whether it all comes from inside and it's all part of genetics and environment. When you find somebody like Ted Bundy, who tortured and killed all those women and sometimes went back and had sex with the dead bodies, I don't think that when you look at his upbringing, you can say, oh, that's because mommy put a clothespin on his dick when he was 4. That behavior was hardwired. Evil is inside us. The older I get, the less I think there's some sort of outside devilish influence. It does come from inside. And unless we're able to address that issue, sooner or later, we'll kill ourselves. And he's asked, what do you mean? He says, well, I read a thing on Huffington Post about a month ago that stayed with me. It was very troubling. It was a pop science thing, which is all I can understand. It's said we've been listening to the stars for 50 years, looking for any signs of life, and there's been nothing but silence. When you see what's going on in the world today, and you have all this conflict, and our technological expertise has far outraced our ability to manage our own emotions. You see it right now with ISIS. What's the solution? The only solution we see with them is to bomb the shit out of those guys so that they can't roll over the world. And that's what's scary about that silence. Maybe all intelligent races hit this level of violence and technological advances that they can't get past, and then they just puff out. You hit the wall, and that's it. So you think humanity's destiny is to someday wipe itself out? He says, I can't see the future, but it's grim. The depletion of resources. We're living in this dine and dash economy. I love the Republicans, too. Whenever it comes to money, the national debt, for instance, they yell their heads off about, what about our grandchildren? But when it comes to the environment, when it comes to resources, they're like, we'll be okay for 40 years. So, some serious problems on the horizon. Now, coming back to something that I had brought up, it was part of the last sentence in that very first part of the book, Dark Christianity. He's asked in the Firewire interview, in the introduction to the expanded edition of The Stand, you called the novel a work of dark Christianity. What did you mean by that? Here's what King says. I was raised Christian, and I was raised to believe in the idea of the Antichrist. My wife said that. She was raised a Catholic. The attitude of the Catholic Church is, give them to me when they're young and they'll be mine forever. It isn't really true. A lot of us grow up and we grow out of the literal interpretation that we get when we're children, but we bear the scars all our life. Whether they're scars of beauty or scars of ugliness, it's pretty much all in the eye of the beholder. I'm interested in the concepts. I'm particularly interested in the idea that in the New Testament, you're suggesting a moral code that's actually enlightened. Basically what Christ preached. Get along with your neighbor and give everything away and follow me. So we're talking pretty much about communism or socialism, all the things the good Christian Republicans in the House of Representatives today are railing about in light of this bailout bill. Of course, Christ never preached give everything away to Wall Street, so they might have a point. I was able to use all those things in The Stand. It's an effort to say, let's give God his due here. Too often in novels that are speculative, God is a kind of kryptonite. And that's about all that it is. And it goes back to Dracula, where someone dumps a crucifix in Count Dracula's face and he pulls away and runs back into his house. That's not religion. That's some kind of juju, like a talisman. I wanted to do more than that. I wanted to explore what that means to be able to rise above adversity by faith, because it's something most of us do every day. We may not call it Christianity. I wanted to do that. I wanted it to be a God trip. So what an interesting thing to say in response to that. Dark Christianity, not namby-pamby Christianity, but something that would really take the gospel messages seriously and not, use a deus ex machina, right, to solve things. That happens in The Stand. All right, in the Paris Review interview, coming back to this, he's asked about how does he group his novels. And here he's going to give us an interesting classificatory scheme. He says, I do two different kinds of books. I think of books like The Stand Desperation and the Dark Tower series as books that go out. Then there are books like Pet Sematary, Misery, The Shining, and Doris Claiborne that go in. Fans will usually either like the outies or they'll like the innies, but they won't like both. The interviewer says, but even in the more supernatural books, the horror is psychological, right? It's not just the boogeyman jumping out from behind a corner. So couldn't they all be characterized as innies? And King says something really interesting here. Well, my categorization is about character and the number of characters. Innies tend to be about one person and go deeper and deeper into a single character. Lissy's Story, my new novel, is an innie, for instance, because it's a long book and there are only a few characters, but a book like Cell is an outie because there's lots of people and it's about friendship and it's a kind of road story. Gerald's Game is the inniest of all the innie books. It's only about one person, Jessie, who's been handcuffed naked to her bed. The little things all get so big, the glass of water, her trying to get the shelf above the bed to tip up so she can escape. Going into that book, I remember thinking that Jessie would have been some sort of gymnast at school, and at the end she would simply put her feet back over her head over the bedstand and wind up standing up. About 40 pages into it, I said to myself, I better see how this works. So I got my son, I think it was Joe because he's more limber of the two boys, and I took him into our bedroom. I tied him with scarves to the bedpost. My wife came in and said, what are you doing? And I said, I'm doing an experiment, never mind. Joe tried to do it. He couldn't. He said, my joints don't work that way. And again, it was what I was talking about with the rabies in Cujo. I'm saying, Jesus Christ, this isn't going to work. And the only thing you can do at that point is say, well, I can make her double jointed. And then you go, yeah, right, that's not fair. Misery was just two characters in a bedroom, but Gerald's Game goes at one better. One character in a bedroom. I was thinking that eventually there's going to be another book that'll just be called Bedroom. There won't be any characters at all. So two very different ways of doing things. You know, The Stand has a vast variety of characters, right? King has said that in different places, I wanted to do a Lord of the Rings. Lord of the Rings has lots of characters like that. We could also think about, Game of Thrones or Ken Liu's recent Dandelion Dynasty, sprawling with many, many point of view characters. Those are outies. And King likes to write those. But he's probably right that there isn't a vast overlap between innie books and outie books, right? Going back to the Fresh Air interview, inevitably, since COVID-19 and the pandemic of 2020, which extended for quite a while, he's going to be asked about that. So the interviewer, Terry Gross, on Fresh Air says, Stephen King, welcome back to Fresh Air. I should probably do it like an imitation of her voice, but I won't. I'm so glad you're well. Is this pandemic the closest thing you've come to living one of your own horror stories? And Stephen King says, well, it is and it isn't. I've had a lot of people get in touch with me after Donald Trump got elected and say, this is just like the Dead Zone. There's a character in the Dead Zone named Greg Stilson, who's kind of an avatar of the common man, and he becomes a state representative, then he rises to the presidency. So this is the second time. And now that Trump is actually president of the United States and there's a pandemic worldwide, I guess that's what pandemic means. That seems it's almost like these two books have cross-pollinated somehow. It's not very comfortable to be me. I keep having people say, gee, it's like we're living in a Stephen King story. And my only response to that is, I'm sorry. And then Gross says, well, you write horror stories and a virus is kind of perfect. Viruses are shapeshifters. They keep the flu virus keeps changing every year or two. That's why we need new vaccines. And viruses aren't exactly alive because they need some kind of living cell in order to survive. So I think scientists say viruses aren't really alive, or they're somewhere between alive and dead. That sounds like a horror story. And the fact they can live in us and we're their hosts and they make us sick and in some cases could kill us, well, that's really the kind of thing you could have invented from scratch. But viruses are real. Do you think of viruses as being just like the essence of a horror story and how they work in us? And, King is going to say a little bit later, when he's asked about the viruses, you were talking about viruses not being alive or dead. This really is like one of those zombie movies. It's like we're in the Night of the Living Dead in a sense, because the virus is just what it is. which is something that's almost incomprehensible to us. And it's incomprehensible to science, too, which is one of the reasons I think that people have to watch out for the quack cures. There's a tendency to jump into thinking that we can master these things. And he says, the thing is, because it's invisible, because we can't see it, we hear these things on the news where they're saying, hey, if you have to go out, make sure you don't touch your face. When you come back in, make sure you wash your hands. Be careful about taking off your shoes. And when you take your shoes off, put them in a certain place. Then wash your hands because you can get the virus on your shoes. So that after a while, I think that a lot of people in America are living almost like Howard Hughes, who had this pathological cleanliness thing. We're all washing our hands, and it's easy to imagine. Terry, think of this. They could be on your hands right now. Germs, viruses like wagon wheels, just they're in your hands, waiting to get inside the warmth of your body where they can multiply and spread. And then once you start thinking about that, it's very hard to unthink it. So it's easy to be paranoid about it. But on the other hand, what's the alternative? A little bit more serious, less fluffy, perhaps, the Firewire interview. He's asked, the stand feels prescient to me. The central threat of the plague virus seems more real now than it did in 1978. The concern with terrorism, the religious elements, the concern about the environment, preoccupation with basic tenets of democracy, all that stuff is there. You said the stand was very much a work of its time, but did you also feel that you were being, well, sort of prophetic? And King says, you never know if you are or not. And you never know how long a book is going to last and how long its concerns are going to hold true. I've always wanted to go back to Firestarter, for instance, which was written about the same period, written after The Stand, and see how that one holds up. Some of the books have been prescient. There's a book called The Running Man, which ends with a guy crashing a hijacked jetliner into a skyscraper, and that's the first thing I thought about after 9/11, was, my God, somebody actually did it. If I were to write The Stand today, I might very well have the bug released by suicide bombers. It might have been some act of ultimate terrorism instead of an accident. At the time, we were all haunted by the idea accidents could happen. This was around the time of Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and that kind of thing. Then he's asked, questions of politics are never very far away in The Stand. Once the plague has come and gone, society has to be reformed. Do you think of it as a political novel in any sense? He says, yeah, I did see it that way. I've always been a political novel, and those things have always interested me. Firestarter is a political novel. The Dead Zone is a political novel. There's that scene in The Dead Zone where Johnny Smith sees Greg Stilson in the future starting a nuclear war. Around my house, we kind of laugh when Sarah Palin comes on TV, and we say, that's Greg Stilson and a woman. And then he's asked, and here's where we're going to finish this up, what did you learn while writing The Stand? And he says, well, I wrote the book in Colorado for the most part, and at that time there was a lot of discussion on the news and on local TV stations about chemical dumps and chemical weapons in Nevada. And so that played a constant background in my thoughts while I was writing it. And at the same time, that's the edge of the Bible Belt, and there were a lot of radio preachers. And one night I heard this guy raving about once in every generation a plague will fall among them. And I started to think about that dichotomy between the spiritual and the technological, and that became the great subject of the book. Isn't that an interesting place to end it? The spiritual and the technological. Not so simple as black and white, good and bad. They permeate each other. I mean, obviously, the big bad guy is spiritual and not merely technological, and the good guys, attempting to be good guys, have to use technology, starting up, generators again, or getting fresh water, working on plants. But there is something really there. So we see a lot of really interesting themes coming out in these interviews talking about this great book. The Stand is not merely a post-apocalyptic novel about human beings and how they're going to get by after some terrible disaster has befallen them. In this case, an incredibly virulent pandemic. It's also a supernatural novel, as we've seen, and one of the key characters in that is Randall Flagg. We get a description of him, actually like an entire chapter devoted to what it is that he does and what he represents. And we're going to talk about the evil that is involved with him. And he's not the sum of evil. He draws other kinds of evil to him, and he fosters it. So, this is in chapter 23. Randall Flagg, the dark man, strode south on US 51, listening to the night sounds that pressed close on both sides of this narrow road that would take him sooner or later out of Idaho and into Nevada. From Nevada, he might go anywhere. From New Orleans to Nogales, from Portland, Oregon to Portland, Maine. It was his country, and none knew or loved it better. He knew where the roads went, and he walked them at night. Now, an hour before dawn, he was somewhere between Grassmere and Riddle, west of Twin Falls, still north of the Duck Valley Reservation that spreads across two states. And wasn't it fine? We get, him walking some more, and we're going to read that he's going to, walk for a while, have some supper, walk again. What's really important is the description that we're going to get. So, here we go. He hammered along, arms swinging by his sides. He was well known along the highways in hiding that are traveled by the poor and the mad, by the professional revolutionaries, and by those who've been taught to hate so well that their hate shows on their faces like hair lips, and they're unwanted except by others like them, who welcome them to cheap rooms with slogans and posters on the walls, to basements where lengths of sawed-off pipe are held in padded vices until they're stuffed with high explosives, to back rooms where lunatic plans are laid to kill a cabinet member, to kidnap the child of a visiting dignitary, or to break into a boardroom meeting of Standard Oil with grenades and machine guns and murder in the name of the people. He was known there, and even the maddest of them could only gaze upon his dark and grinning face at an oblique angle. The women he took to bed with him, even if they reduced intercourse to something as casual as getting a snack from the refrigerator, accepted him with a stiffening of the body, a turning away of countenance. They took him the way they might take a ram with golden eyes or a black dog, and when it was done, they were cold, so cold. It seemed impossible they could ever be warm again. When he walked into a meeting, the hysterical babble ceased, the backbiting, recriminations, the accusations, the ideological rhetoric. For a moment there would be dead silence, then they would start to turn to him and turn away, as if he'd come to them with some old and terrible engine of destruction cradled in his arms, something 1,000 times worse than the plastic explosive made in the basement labs of renegade chemistry students, or the black market arms obtained from some greedy army post-supply sergeant. It seemed to them, that he'd come to them with a device gone rusty with blood and packed for centuries in the cosmoline of screams, but now ready again, carried to their meeting like some infernal gift. And when the talk began again, it would be rational and disciplined as madmen can make it, and things would be agreed upon. And we hear about him being involved in all of these different sorts of scenarios, right? And then he stops. Why? Because something was coming. He could feel it, almost taste it on the night air. He could taste it, a sooty hot taste that came from everywhere, as if God was planning a cookout and all of civilization was going to be the barbecue. Already the charcoal was hot, white, and flaky outside, as red as demons' eyes inside. A huge thing, a great thing. His time of transfiguration was at hand. He was going to be born for the second time. He was going to be squeezed out of the laboring cunt of some great sand-colored beast that even now lay in the throes of its contractions, its legs moving slowly as the birth blood gushed, its sun-hot eyes glaring into the emptiness. He had been born when times changed, and the times were going to change again. It was almost time to be reborn. He knew. Why else could he suddenly do magic? So, we are going to see him doing that magic soon after that, right? And Nick Andros, one of the important main characters, the deaf-mute guy who will become part of the important organizing council once he gets to, the western cities, has a dream. He was on a high place. The land was spread out below him like a relief map. It was desert land, and the stars above had the mad clarity of altitude. There was a man beside him. No, not a man, but the shape of a man, as if the figure had been cut from the fabric of reality, and what really stood beside him was a negative man, a black hole in the shape of a man. And the voice of this shape whispered, "Everything you see will be yours if you fall down on your knees and worship me." Nick shook his head, wanting to step away from that awful drop, afraid the shape would stretch out its black arms and push him over the side. "Why don't you speak? Why do you just shake your head?" In the dream, Nick made the gesture he'd made so many times in the waking world, a laying of fingers on his lips, then the flat of his hand against his throat, and he heard himself say, in a perfectly clear, rather beautiful voice, "I can't talk. I am mute." "But you can. If you want to, you can." Nick reached out to touch the shape then, his fear momentarily swept away in a flood of amazement and burning joy. But as his hand neared that figure's shoulder, it turned ice cold, so cold it seemed he'd burned it. He jerked it away with ice crystals forming on the knuckles, and it came to him. He could hear the dark shape's voice, the far-off cry of a hunting bird night, the endless whine of the wind. He was struck mute all over again by the wonder of it. There was a new dimension to the world he'd never missed because he'd never experienced it, and now it fell into place. He was hearing sounds. He seemed to know what each was without being told. They were pretty, pretty sounds. He ran his fingers back and forth across his shirt and marveled at the swift whisper of his nails on the cotton. Then the dark man was turning toward him, and Nick was terribly afraid. This creature, whatever it was, performed no free miracles. "If you fall down on your knees and worship me." Now notice what comes next. And Nick put his hands over his face because he wanted all the things the black man shape had shown him from this high desert place. Cities, women, treasure, power. But most of all, he wanted to hear the entrancing sound his fingernails made on his shirt. The secret sound of rain. But the word he said was no. And then the freezing cold was on him again, and he'd been pushed, and he was falling end over end, screaming soundlessly. The good people in this story are not entirely good, just, paladins or avatars of goodness. They have to deal with temptation. Later on, we get some interesting visions of Mother Abigail, right, who is calling people to Colorado, right, and Wyoming. So Nadine, another major character that we're going to encounter. First we get a dream coming. He lay in his blankets wondering if she might come to him while Joe was asleep or if he should go to her. He dreamed he was lost. He was in a field of corn, lost there, but there was music, guitar music. Joe was playing the guitar. If he found Joe, he would be all right. It wasn't Joe playing the guitar. How could it have been? Joe was holding his left hand and Nadine his right. They were with him. An old woman was playing the guitar, a jazzy sort of spiritual that had Joe smiling. The old woman was black, and she was sitting on the porch, and Larry guessed she was about the oldest woman he'd ever seen in his life. But there was something about her that made him feel good in the way his mother had once made him feel good when he was very little. And she would suddenly hug him and say, "Here's the best boy. Here's Alice Underwood's all-time best boy." The old woman stopped playing and looked up at them. "Well, I say, I got me company. Stepping out where I can see 'em. My peepers ain't what they was." And Nadine asks who she is. "Mother Abigail is what they call me. I'm the oldest woman in eastern Nebraska, I guess, and I still make my own biscuits. You can come see me as quick as you can. We got to go before he gets wind of us." "Before who gets wind of us?" Nadine asked, presciently. And Larry wished he could speak, cry out for her to take the question back before it could leap free and hurt them. "The black man, the servant of the devil. We got the Rockies between him and us, praise God, but they won't keep him back. That's why we got to knit together. In Colorado, God came to me in a dream and showed me where, but we got to be quick as we can anyway. You come see me. There's others coming too." "No," Nadine said in a cold and fearful voice. "We're going to Vermont. That's all, only to Vermont." just a short trip. Your trip will be longer than ours if and you don't fight off his power, the old woman in Larry's dream replied. She was looking at Nadine with great sadness. This could be a good man you got here, woman. He wants to make something of himself. Why don't you cleave to him instead of using him? And so, there's interesting things happening in those dreams. And as we know, well, spoiler alert, Nadine is going to be the bride or concubine, however you want to frame it, of Sprague. Later on, we get a discussion that I've already mentioned before. Is Sprague, the dark man, actually real? And where does he fit in the schema with, God? So we're continuing that conversation. Mother Abigail says, I don't know. It's God's way. He don't explain to the likes of Abby Fremantle. If this is his way, Ralph said, why, I wish he'd retire and let somebody younger take over. If the dark man is west, Nick wrote, maybe we ought to pick up stakes and move east. She shook her head patiently. Nick, all things serve the Lord. Don't you think this black man serves him too? He does, no matter how mysterious his purpose may be. The black man will follow you no matter where you run, because he serves the purpose of God, and God wants you to treat with him. And it don't do no good to run from the will of the Lord God of hosts. A man or woman who tries that only ends up in the belly of the beast. Nick wrote briefly. Ralph studied the note, rubbed the side of his nose, and wished he didn't have to read it. Old ladies like this didn't cotton to stuff like what Nick had just written. She'd likely call it a blasphemy and shout it loud enough to wake everybody in the place too. What's he say? Abigail asked. He says he doesn't believe in God. The message relayed. He looked unhappily down at his shoes and waited for the explosion. But she only got up, chuckled, got up and walked across to Nick. She took the note out of his hands and patted it. Bless you, Nick. That don't matter. He believes in you. So what we have here is a world in which we do have, forces of good, and, we have forces of evil, and we have a God above. But the God is not an easy one to know, but is impossible to avoid. Further on, when we're looking at Harold. Harold is a corrupted guy, and we're going to look at him a little bit more down the line. But Harold is going to play a part in this plan that Sprague has. So this is Mother Abigail thinking about things, and she says they would get the power back on. Of course, it was one of the things God had shown her in her dreams. She knew a goodish number of things about what was to come here, some from dreams, some from her own common sense. The two were too intertwined to tell apart. Soon all these people would stop running around like chickens with their heads cut off and start pulling together. She was not a sociologist like that Glenn Bateman, but she knew that people always did pull together after a while. The curse and blessing of the human race was in chumminess. If 6 people went floating down the Mississippi on a church roof in a flood, they'd start a bingo game as soon as the roof grounded on a sandbar. First, they'd want to form some kind of government, another theme we're going to come back to. Probably one they'd want to run around her. Now, notice what she's going to do. She couldn't allow that, of course, as much as she would like to. Why not? That wouldn't be God's will. Let them run all the things that had to do with this earth, get the power back on, fine. First thing she was going to try out was that trash masher. Get the gas running so they wouldn't freeze their behinds off this winter. Let them pass their resolutions and make their plans. That was fine. She would keep her nose right out of that part. She would insist Nick have a part in the running of it, and maybe Ralph. The Texans seemed all right. And then she says she supposed they might want that fat boy, that Harold, and she wouldn't stop them. But she didn't like him. Harold made her nervous, all the time grinning. But the grin never touched his eyes. He was pleasant. He said the right things. But his eyes were like 2 cold flints poking out of the ground. She thought that Harold had some kind of secret, some smelly, nasty thing, all wrapped up in the stinking poultice in the middle of his heart. She had no idea what it might be. But it was not God's will for her to see that. So it must not matter to his plan for this community. Although it will, right? All the same, it troubled her to think that fat boy might be part of their high councils. But she would say nothing, right? And then she thinks about the dark man. Her business had only to do with the dark man. He had no name, although it pleased him to call himself Flag, at least for the time being. And on the far side of the mountains, his work was already well begun. She didn't know his plans. They were as veiled from her eyes as whatever secrets lay in this fat boy Harold's heart. But she didn't have to know the specifics. Her goal was clear and simple, to destroy all of them. Her understanding of him was surprisingly sophisticated. The people who had been drawn to the free zone all came to see her in this place, and she received them, though they sometimes made her tired. And they all wanted to tell her that they dreamed of her and him. They were terrified of him. And she nodded and comforted and soothed as best she could. But privately, she thought that most of them wouldn't want to know this Flag if they met him on the street unless he wanted to be noticed. They might feel him, a cold chill, the kind you got when a goose walked over your grave, a sudden hot feeling like a fever flash, or sharp and momentary drilling pain in the ears or temples. But these people were wrong to think he had 2 heads or 6 eyes or big spike horns growing out of his temples. He probably didn't look much different than the man who used to bring the milk or the mail. She guessed that behind the conscious evil, there was an unconscious blackness. That was what distinguished the earth's children of darkness. They couldn't make things, but only break them. God the Creator had made man in his own image, and that meant that every man and woman who dwelt under God's light was a creator of some sort, a person with the urge to stretch out his hand and shape the world into some rational pattern. The black man was able only to unshape. Antichrist? You might as well say anti-creation. He would have his followers, of course, and that was nothing new. He was a liar, and his father was the father of lies. He would be like a big neon sign to them, standing high to the sky, dazzling their sight with fizzling fireworks. They would not be apt to notice, these apprentice unshapers, that like a neon sign, he only made the same simple patterns over and over again. They would not be apt to realize that if you release the gas that makes the pretty patterns from its complex assortment of tubes, it floats silently away and dissipates, leaving not a taste or so much as a whiff or a smell behind. Some would make the deduction for themselves in time. His kingdom would never be one of peace. Would he win? She had no assurance he would not. She knew he must be as aware of her as she was of him, and nothing would give him more pleasure than to see her scrawny black body hung up to the sky on a cross of telephone poles for the crows to pick. Would he win? That was not for her to know either. God worked discreetly and in ways that pleased him. We'll find out he doesn't win, right? But he seems to be close to winning at a number of points, right? So we find out that, there's a number of things going on. They try to send, the Boulder people try to send spies and missions, and Mother Abigail actually, leaves, comes back. Now we're going to find out again, Bragg has all these plans that he's pulling together, all these evil people, but we find out things are slowly slipping out of his hands. He was losing himself. Once he had been able to look back over the 60s, 70s, and 80s like a man looking down a double flight of stairs leading into a darkened room. Now he could only clearly remember the events since the superflu. Beyond that, there was nothing but a haze that would sometimes lift a little bit, just enough to afford a glimpse of some enigmatic object or memory before closing down again. The earliest memory he could be sure of now was walking south on US 51, of being born again. He was no longer strictly a man if he'd ever been one. He was like an onion, slowly peeling away one layer at a time, only it was the trappings of humanity that seemed to be peeling away, organized reflection, memory, possibly even free will if there'd ever been such a thing. And he's thinking about the plans that he's got going. In a month or less, the National Guard jets would be flying with a full complement of Shrike missiles tucked under their wings. And when he felt sure that his bride, Nadine, had conceived, they would fly east. Right? And he's going to unleash nuclear war on them in addition to bombing them with regular stuff. we get a confrontation, right, between the people who've been captured now and Sprague himself. And he learns. They're coming. Stu Redmond, Glenn Bateman, Ralph Brentner, and Larry Underwood. They're coming, and they'll kill you like a chicken-stealing weasel. Right? This is what he's being told. Everything you made here is falling apart, and why not? The effective half-life of evil is always relatively short. People are whispering about you. They're saying you let Tom Cullen get away, just a simple retarded boy, but smart enough to outwit Randall Flagg. This is the spy who is sent. They're saying your weapons expert has gone crazy and you didn't know it was going to happen. They're afraid what he brings back from the desert next time may be for them instead of the people in the East, and they're leaving. Did you know that? You lie, this is Bragg. His face was parchment white. They wouldn't dare, and if they were, I'd know. I see them, she whispered. They're leaving their posts in the dead of the night, and your eye doesn't see them. They're leaving their posts and sneaking away. A work crew goes out with 20 people and comes back with 18. The border guards are defecting. They're afraid the balance of power is shifting on its own. They're leaving you, and the ones that are left won't lift a finger when the men from the East come to finish you off once and for all. And he kills her through this, right? You lie, he screamed at her. His hand slammed down on her shoulders, snapping both collarbones like pencils. He lifted her body high over his head, and he pivoted on his heels, and he threw her up and out as he'd thrown the glass. He saw the great smile of relief and triumph on her face. She baited him into doing it, understanding somehow only he could set her free, and she was carrying his child. So this is actually Nadine. His plans are falling apart. And what we get here is, Glenn and Stu and Ralph all going around together. And they're talking about, what's happening as they're slowly, losing bits and pieces of themselves on the way. And Glenn says, if you read your Bible, you see it was pretty traditional for these prophets to go in the wilderness from time to time. Old Testament magical mystery tours. The time span given to these jaunts was usually 40 days, 40 nights, a Hebraic idiom that really means no one knows how long he was gone, but it was quite a while. Now think of yourself as a battery. You really are. Your brain runs on electrical current. For that matter, your muscles run on tiny charges too. Once you started running down, everything runs off the battery, right? And so we have to strip off all the accessories so the battery can be strong. It's the same with people. The Bible tells us about Isaiah and Job and the others, but it doesn't say how many prophets came back from the wilderness with visions that crisped their brains. I have a healthy respect for human intelligence and the human psyche. And he says the capacity of the human mind is a lot bigger than the biggest Delco battery. And they're changing. And then what we get in the end is a conflagration, right? They've been captured, and Flagg is going to kill all of them, right? And Canman is coming back with a weapon. And Larry stared down at him. Flagg came to a halt between the two cages and stood grinning. Flagg turned away from them and faced his people, and he condemns all of them, and then they say, Flagg's not your name, why don't you tell him your real name? Right? And he goes on, and he's like doing the condemnation. And then suddenly Whitney says, hey, you people. A confused murmur ran through the crowd. Whitney was shaking all over as with palsy. Flagg regarded Whitney with a ferocious smile. This ain't right. You know it ain't. We was Americans once. This ain't how Americans act. I wasn't so much, I'll tell you that, nothing but a cook, but I know this ain't how Americans act, listening to some murdering freak in cowboy boots. A horrified, rustling gasp came from those new Las Vegans. Larry and Ralph exchanged a puzzled glance. That's what he is. You think you want to watch these two guys ripped in two and right in front of you? You think that's a way to start a new life? You think a thing like that can ever be right? I tell you, you'll have nightmares about it for the rest of your lives. And then Sprague says, Whitney, you should have kept still. Right? I knew about your plans. I knew what you meant to do before you did. And I would have let you crawl away until I was ready to take you back. But what actually happens? Whitney says, you ain't a man at all. You're some kind of devil. Sprague says, yes, that's right, I am. And he's making a ball of fire. But then, trash can man is coming through. Sprague felt terror seep into the chambers of his heart. It was a terror of the unknown and the unexpected. He'd foreseen everything. Even Whitney's foolish spur-of-the-moment speech. He'd foreseen everything, but this, his crowd was parting, peeling back. There was a scream, high, clear, and freezing. Someone broke and ran, then someone else. Hold still, Sprague cried at the top of his voice, but it was useless. They ran, scattering to all parts of the compass. It was Donald Mervyn Elbert, now known as the Trash Can Man, now and forever, world without end, hallelujah, amen. He was behind the wheel of a long, dirty electric cart. The cart's batteries were nearly drained dry. The cart was humming and buzzing and lurching. The Trash Can Man bobbed back and forth like a mad marionette. He was in the last stages of radiation sickness. His hair was gone. His arms, poking out of the tatters of his shirt, were covered with open, running sores. And he says, I brought you the fire. I'm sorry. And then what happens? He says, it's the big one. It's the A-bomb. The big fire, my life for you. And Lloyd is saying, take it away. It's dangerous. Make him get rid of it, Lloyd, the dark man who was now the pale man whined. Make him take it back where he got it. Make him. Where is he? Where is he? He's gone. Where is he? What did you do to him? And then suddenly Ralph shrieked, Larry, Larry, the hand of God. Larry looked up. He saw the ball of electricity. A flag had flicked from the end of his finger. It had grown to tremendous size. It hung in the air, jittering towards the trash can man, giving off sparks like hair. Larry realized dimly the air was now so full of electricity, every hair in his own body was standing on end. And the thing in the sky did look like a hand. No, the dark man wailed. Larry looked at him, but Flag was no longer there. He had a bare impression of something monstrous standing in front where Flag had been, something slumped and hunched and almost without shape, something with enormous yellow eyes slit by dark cat's pupils. Then it was gone. Larry saw Flag's clothes, the jacket, the jeans, the boots standing upright with nothing in them. For a split second, they held the shape of the body that had been inside them, and then they collapsed. The crackling blue fire in the air rushed at the yellow electric cart. It lost hair. This is the trash can man, but he had gotten it there. The blue ball of fire flung itself into the back of the cart, seeking what was there, drawn to it. Oh, shit, we're all fucked, Lloyd cried. He put his hands over his head and fell to his knees. Oh, God, thank God, Larry thought. I will feel no evil. I will. Silent white light filled the world, and the righteous and unrighteous alike were consumed in the holy fire. Flag's empire is destroyed. His hold on the people who survived the plague is gone. He's not completely gone himself. He's going to be reborn in another place, as we're going to see. But this chapter of evil versus good, at least to some degree, has come to an end. The supernatural part of it. In the interest of this video not going excessively long, although it's already been going on for quite a bit, I'm only going to talk about one other set of interconnected themes, which we could call both political and ethical, that are running throughout The Stand. And I'm doing this in place of being able to talk about Stephen King's biography. We didn't get to that, and that'll just have to be okay this time around. And I want to begin kind of far into the book with a particular passage when Stu and Glenn are talking about the buildup in Boulder. So we've got the two population centers, Las Vegas, and the rest of Nevada and what's left of California to work with across the Rockies, and then we've got Colorado. And what we're finding out is that, there's going to be kind of a race to establish themselves. And so he says that, maybe this Sprague guy could end up with 900,000 people, and we'd end up with that. And then, they're like, no, the coming winter is going to take its toll. It's going to take it here. It's going to be tougher for the small groups that don't make it here. The American population might be down to 1.6 million by next spring, and that's a kind estimate. We might just get 1 million people. Stu says, 1 million people, I just can't picture that. This town would be bursting at its seams. And, then he says, why do you think we'd get most of the people? And then Glenn says, for a very unscientific reason. I like to believe most people are good, and I believe whoever's running the show west of us is really bad. But I have a hunch. And he says, I think he's going to get most of the techies. Don't ask me why. It's just a hunch, except that tech people like to work in an atmosphere of tight discipline and linear goals for the most part. They like it when the trains run on time. What we've got here in Boulder right now is mass confusion, everyone bopping along and doing his own thing, and we've got to do something about what my students would have called getting our shit together. But that other fellow, I bet he's got the trains running on time and all his ducks in a row, and techies are just as human as the rest of us. They'll go where they're wanted the most. I've got a suspicion our adversary wants as many as he can get. F the farmers, he'd just as soon have a few men who can dust off those Idaho missile silos and get them operational again. Ditto tanks and helicopters, and maybe a B-52 bomber or two just for chuckles. Right now he's probably still concentrating on getting the power back on, reestablishing communications. Maybe he's even had to engage in a purge of the faint-hearted. But, when I watch the sun go down at night, I get scared. I don't need no bad dreams to scare me anymore. All I need to do is think about them on the other side of the Rockies, busy as bees. And so Stu says, what should we be doing? And Glenn says, should I give you a list? And that's when they, start actually thinking about what they're going to do. And he says, okay, here it is, Stu. First, recreate America, little America, by fair means and foul. Organization and government come first. If it starts now, we can form the sort of government we want. If we wait until the population triples, we're going to have grave problems. Let's say we call a meeting a week from today. That would make it August 18th. Everyone to attend. Before the meeting, there should be an ad hoc organization committee. Committee of 7, let's say. You, me, Andros, Fran, Harold Lauder, maybe a couple more. The job of the committee would be to create an agenda for the meeting. And I can tell you what some of the items on the agenda should be. First, reading a ratification of the Declaration of Independence. Second, the Constitution. Third, the Bill of Rights. Christ, Glenn, we're all Americans. No, that's where you're wrong, Glenn said. We're a bunch of survivors with no government at all. We're a hodgepodge collection from every age group, religious group, class group, and racial group. Government is an idea, Stu. That's really all it is. Once you strip away all the bureaucracy and the bullshit, I'll go further. It's an inculcation, nothing but a memory path worn through the brain. What we've got going for us now is culture lag. Most of these people still believe in government by representation, the republic, what they think of government as democracy. But culture lag never lasts long. After a while, they'll start having the gut reactions. The president is dead. The Pentagon is for rent. Nobody's debating anything in the House and Senate. Our people here are going to wake up to the fact that the old ways are gone and they can restructure society any old way they want. We need to catch them before they wake up and do something nutty. So that's one paradigm. What's happening over on the other side of the Rockies is a kind of despotism, but one that makes the trains run on time. Two different models of political organization, both possible in the aftermath of this cataclysm. We're going to come back to some of the more strictly ethical questions in a bit, but we get this very interesting thing with the mass meeting, right? The ad hoc committee is going to turn out to be Nick Andros, Glenn Bateman, Ralph Brentner, Richard Ellis, Fran Goldsmith, Stuart Redmond, and Susan Stern. And Howard is not part of that. Harold, rather. Harold is going to get kind of upset, right? If Stu and Glenn had seen copies, and he was sure they had by now, this is Nick, they knew that he had unilaterally stricken Harold Lauder's name from their list of ad hoc committee meetings. They might want to do some horse trading of their own, and if he had to, he would do it just to keep Harold out of the top. If he had to, he'd give them Ralph. Ralph didn't really want the position anyway. And it goes on, right? He turned back to the page he'd been doodling on when Ralph came in. He stared at the words he'd circled not just once, but 3 times as if to keep them in. Authority, organization. He suddenly wrote another below them. There was room. Now the words in the triple circle read, authority, organization, politics. This is very important, right? Authority, both sides have that, or they're constructing it. The authority flows down from Randall Bragg in the west of the Rockies, and it flows up from the people, but also Mother Abigail on the other side. Organization, very important as well. Politics. Politics means engaging with other people, trying to work out solutions, not just to impose them by force or fear or fraud, right? So he thinks there's hundreds of people here and thousands more on their way. When Ralph and I and Mother and Tom Cullen and the rest of our party got here, the only living things in Boulder were the cats and the deer that came down here. And he thinks we're Johnny-come-latelys. We haven't even been here a month yet, but we were first. And he thinks, once again, about Harold Lauder. And he thinks, mostly it's that grin. I don't want to have to share secrets with anyone who grins like that and looks like he isn't sleeping well at night. The world, he thought, not according to Garp, but according to the superflu. This brave new world. But it didn't seem particularly brave to him or particularly new. It was as if somebody had put a large cherry bomb into a child's toy box. There had been a big bang and everything had gone everywhere. Toys had scattered from one end of the playroom to the other. Some things were shattered beyond repair. Other things would be fixable. Most of the stuff had just been scattered. Those things were still a little too hot to handle, but they'd be fine once they'd cooled off. Meanwhile, the job was to sort things out, throw away the things which were no longer good, set aside the toys which could be fixed, list everything which was still okay, get a new toy box to put the things in, a nice new toy box, a strong toy box. There was a frightening, sickening ease and a clear attraction to the way things can be blown apart. The hard job is bringing things together again, the sorting, the fixing, the listing, and discarding things which are no good, of course. A little bit later, we're going to have this discussion here, and there's election of people to be in charge and authorities, and Stu Arnett is going to end up getting some authority as a policeman, essentially. That's quite important. Eventually they have this meeting, and what happens then? Well, actually I'm going to come back to this. They are going to read the Constitution. They're going to reconstitute things. They're going to get the city back up and going, and they're going to have votes on things with the standing committee leading things. But interestingly, a lot of the standing committee, after the bombing by Harold Lauder, which now we really need to talk about that. Harold Lauder is definitely a damaged man. He's jealous of Franny, who he would like the affections of, but Stu gets. He pretends to like everybody, but as that we've noted, there's ice behind his smile. And he's going to get in with Bragg and Nadine, who's also attracted to him. And as a matter of fact, Nadine is going to, for a while, after she's offered herself to Larry and he's turned her down, give sexual favors to Harold to bring him into the fold. And what does Harold do? He assembles a bomb. He also has, after he finds Franny's diary, where she talks about, her views on Harold, he starts writing his own. And Harold, here's his sort of like discourse. Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Harold Emery Lauder, and I'm here to tell you that in the words of the old song, the fundamental things apply as time goes by, like Darwin. The next time you stand and sing the national anthem, friends and neighbors, chew on this. America is dead. Dead as a doornail. Dead as Jacob Marley and Buddy Holly and the Big Bopper and Harry Truman. Dead, but the principles propounded by Mr. Darwin are still very much alive. As alive as Jacob Marley's ghost was to Ebenezer Scrooge. Dog eat dog. The top dog rules. While you're meditating on the beauties of constitutional rule, spare a little time to meditate on Randall Flagg, man of the West. I doubt very much if he has any time to spare for such fripperies as public meetings and ratifications and discussions on the true meaning of a peach in the best liberal mode. Instead, he has been concentrating on the basics on his Darwin, preparing to wipe the great Formica counter of the universe with your dead bodies. Ladies and gentlemen, let me modestly suggest that while we're trying to get the lights on and waiting for a doctor to find our happy little hive, he may be searching eagerly for someone of the pilot's credentials so he can start overflights of Boulder in the best Gary Francis Powers tradition. While we debate the burning question of who will be on the street cleaning committee, he's probably already seen to the creation of gun cleaning committee, not to mention mortars, missile sites, and possibly even germ warfare centers. Of course, we know this country doesn't have any germ or biological warfare centers. That's one of the things that makes this country great. What country? But you should realize while we're busy getting all our wagons in a circle, then he stops his sort of soliloquy. But these are the thoughts that are going through Harold Lauder's head. And we're going to see that one of the perennial issues in here is not just political organization, it's ethics at the level of individual people. And as I remarked earlier, the good characters are not people who are innocent paragons of virtue. As a matter of fact, Larry is somebody who has to struggle quite a bit to become good, right? There's goodness in him, but he has to bring it out. And part of it is actually going to be in, rejecting Nadine and being with the woman, Lucy, who he is with, right? Who made herself available to him. And she's worried about Nadine stealing her away, right? And he's going to reject Nadine. Nadine then is going to go to Harold at the bequest of Bragg and bring him, his treacherous person, into the fold. But who else do we have? Nick Andros, who's going to die in the bombing, but who's so absolutely important. He is a deaf-mute wanderer who gets beaten up, winds up taking on the sheriff's position as the sheriff dies, and ends up becoming the person who leads so many others to Mother Abigail and helps to lead the community. And he takes on more and more of a role than he ever thought he could do. Stu is another great example. He loves Franny, but when he's charged by a dying Mother Abigail to head west and to, along with Larry and Ralph and Glenn, to go west and take on this seemingly impossible task, he asks, Larry asks, do we have a choice? Mother Abigail says, a choice? There's always a choice. That's God's way. Always will be. Your will is still free. Do as you will. But this is what God wants of you. Now, in this case, right, Ralph says, okay, I'll go along with it. Larry says, okay. Glenn says that, but Stu has, kind of responsibilities. And we see that before he departs. There's a lot of soul searching that has to take place, right? I guess I don't have this marked. I'll just tell you what happens. Franny she's pregnant. She's not super happy with Stu leaving, and Stu's not happy with his leaving, but he realizes, I got to do this. And they come to terms with it. They have a picnic, they make love, they kiss, and she gives him her blessing, essentially, to go off and do the seeming suicide mission that he's been placed upon. So we have all these rising to the occasion. And some people are doing this, with very deliberate actions or great speeches. Other people are just keeping the lights on and comforting somebody who needs it. And there's others who are making different choices. Harold Lauder, Nadine, they both betray Harold to the point of killing, right? And there'll even be a betrayal between the two of them as well. It turns out that Nadine was essentially just using him, right? When he breaks his leg. And she says, it's better this way, Harold. Better for you, because his way, Bragg's way, would have been so much worse. You wouldn't want to meet him face to face. He feels that someone who would betray one side would probably betray the other. He'd kill you, but he'd drive you mad first. He has that power. He let me choose, this way or his way. I chose this. You can end it quickly if you're brave. You know what I mean. And he says, what about you? Aren't you a betrayer too? And she says, I never betrayed him in my heart. And then Harold says, I believe that's exactly where you did betray him. And she will betray him after he, impregnates her and she sees things a little bit more clearly. There'll be an important confrontation. So what we have here is this incredibly important theme of figuring out, without knowing everything, without knowing how things are going to turn out, are you going to be good? And it's often a challenge to be good, to remain good, to persevere in goodness. Or are you going to be bad? And after you've screwed up and you've been bad, are you going to come back from that and find some way to fix it as best as you can or redeem yourself? Or are you going to say, well, I've been bad, may as well go whole hog? There's an entire community, not everybody over there as we see, but an entire community of people over there ruled by force and fear, and with Bragg at the top, thinking that they're going to win, dominating, exploiting, damaging, but ultimately creating nothing. And on the other side, people who are committed, even though they're scared, even though they're in some respects desperate, they're trying to reconstitute what is good in life, in communities, in a nation, but also in families, in friendships, in relationships, in having neighbors. And so this is a clash that is playing out within human hearts. And one of the geniuses of Stephen King, and this is what I'm actually going to close on for this session, is that he's able to so vividly depict these characters through their dialogue, through their thoughts, through the things that they write down, and through the changes that they undergo because of their experiences, their actions, what it is that they suffer from others' actions. And so because he's done this, an ethical theme that, is it surpassing the supernatural? Not exactly. Because the supernatural does have to do with good and evil and maybe something beyond it, a conception of God that is quite elevated but also very mysterious. But there is a lot of room for the human good and evil, and for good and evil characters to show themselves in this master novel, which we get to read in its full form as Stephen King originally intended it and eventually brought it back to be. So with that, we'll conclude. And if you're watching this for the very first time, we're going to continue the discussion elsewhere. You can certainly continue the discussion here on this video through comments. And I hope if you haven't yet read The Stand, I've given you a few spoilers, but not so many that it would deprive you of the joy of reading this. I hope that you do read it. And if you have read it, I hope that this rings true to you and maybe gives you some additional food for thought for a novel that perhaps you've already gotten so much out of.